Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for being here. My name is Martin Tully. I am the mayor of Downers Grove. If we haven't had the chance to meet before, good morning, welcome, it's nice to meet you. Let me start with a few introductions just so we know who some of the speakers are going to be here today as we interact both with you and the audience at home, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. In addition to myself, of course, my colleagues in the Village Council here today, Commissioner Greg Jose, Commissioner Becky Rankin, Commissioner Sean Durkin, Commissioner Jeff Neustadt, and Commissioner Bob Barnett. Commissioner David Olson sends his apologies. He had a last-minute conflict come up, and he won't be able to attend today, so he wanted to send his regrets in that regard. You'll probably also be hearing possibly from our village manager, David Fieldman, our deputy village manager, Mike Baker. You definitely will be hearing respect to the topic of why we're all here today. And then as the questions arise, we may hear from our police chief or from our fire department, but we'll kind of see how things go. Once again, welcome to Village Hall. Thank you for being here. This is the first of two very special town hall meetings that the village has put on with respect to the topic of the current proposal for several Village of Downers Grove facilities and the plan for those facilities, both with respect to what they would be, where they would be, and how we would pay for them. We wanted to have these meetings because we had heard that there was some perception in the community or some thought in the community that there wasn't enough understanding as to what's going on. What are you guys doing? What are you building? Where are you putting it? What's going on? I want to know more about it. So we wanted to be more informative about this process in addition to the meetings that we've held in the past, and put on these two special town hall meetings which are dedicated solely to this topic. What are we doing? What's proposed? Where's it going? Timing? How's it being paid for? What are the revenue streams? All that information. This is the second of two meetings, and this one's super duper special because in addition to being in front of a live studio audience, we are also having this meeting broadcast through YouTube to anyone who wants to watch it, and they're watching it right now. For that reason, using the microphones today is going to be very, very important because while we might be able to hear you here in Village Hall, the folks who are at home with their cup of coffee, maybe their second cup of coffee at this point in time, I won't be able to hear you or us. So I won't walk around like Phil Donahue the whole time. I will probably go up there just so that the cameras and the microphones can pick up everything that's being said. We are going to be taking email questions from people who are watching remotely through electronic means. So from 9 until 10, folks who are not here with us this morning will be able to email in questions, and we encourage all of you watching from outside Village Hall to email in questions, and we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can, in addition to those that we're going to hear from the folks that are here at Village Hall this morning. Let me pause for a moment and take a step back. How did we even get to this point in time? The facilities challenge, and particularly the challenge of Village Hall and the police station, and the status and future of those two facilities is one that is not new. This is an issue that, frankly, since I first got involved with the Village of Downers Grove in 2001, it has been an issue from at least that point in time, if not earlier. In fact, back in 2007, there was a facilities needs study that was done, and a design was put together, and even a funding plan for a new Village Hall and a new police station that would have been approximately in the same place, Village campus, that they are today. That plan was ready to go, and then something you may all recall happened pretty seriously in 2008, and that was called the Great Recession. And that put a lot of things on hold for a lot of people and a lot of municipalities. But unlike a bottle of wine, this problem didn't get better with the passage of time. So here we are 7 years later, and the problem is still there. And hopefully, a number of you had an opportunity to take the tour. By show of hands, how many folks were able to participate in the tours that were conducted today? Terrific, thank you. And for those who are watching from home, if you are interested in taking a tour, please let us know, and I'm sure we can arrange other tours in the future because seeing the facilities up front and personal is pretty important. Those facilities have not gotten any better in the last 7 years, let's put it that way. So one thing that I think everyone is pretty much in agreement on, and has been for almost 10 years, if not longer, is that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. So the real question is, how do we address that problem? What is the best way to address that problem? And we did revisit this issue because it wasn't getting any better. So in 2012, we then looked at things again, 5 years later, and identified, and you probably heard this on the tour, approximately $10 million of investment that would be necessary just to maintain the existing facilities in the condition that they should be, without changing the functionality such that they would actually support the needs of a 21st century village and police department. $10 million. So we started thinking, all right, $10 million. We're going to put $10 million in these buildings. If we're going to be spending that kind of money, we really ought to be looking at what's the best way, not just to put Band-Aids and Scotch tape and airplane glue on the buildings we have now, but are there better ways and better places for these buildings to be? We did look at a number of different scenarios. And one scenario was do nothing, but no one thought that's a good idea. So one scenario was simply spend the $10 million and fix what we have. Another scenario was to do what we were talking about in 2007, which was to build a new village hall, a new police station right here. We hopefully will have some of that information about what those costs will be, but those were available and discussed earlier in this year. The council, through a series of meetings that took place in February, March, and even as recently as September of this year, looked at those different proposals. But one thing we had done was we had challenged village staff to really think creatively and out of the box. If we're going to take on this big project and we're going to have to spend this kind of money anyway, what else can we do? Can we be more creative? Can we be more innovative? Can we solve multiple problems? I don't know, is anyone here a fan of the Alton Brown Show? Ever seen any of his programs on the Food Network? One of the things that Alton Brown says is never buy a tool for your kitchen that only serves one purpose. He's a big fan of multitasking. So if you're going to buy a tool, it should be able to do more than one thing. So we had challenged village staff to come up with some thoughts about not only solving the police and village hall situation, but other challenges that have plagued us in the village that we can try to solve with this project. And so we came up with one option that has a lot of moving parts. It's very private sector-like. It's not very government-like. It's very creative and has phases, and there's lots of pieces. It involves moving the fleet garage. It involves building a new village hall. It involves moving the police station, relocating a fire station, putting in stoplights, taking land that has currently not been used and unable to be used for 20 years, and putting it to some use. Redeveloping prime walk-to-train land here at the village campus into something else. Is that a better use for the land than what it's currently being used for? Very creative, innovative, lots of moving pieces. And also we challenged them to think, are there other units of government that we can partner with to solve some of their facilities challenges as long as we're undertaking this effort? So for all those reasons, the proposal that the council ultimately narrowed down their focus to is the one that we'll be talking about today and that we've been talking about for a while. But I wanted to emphasize that was one that we arrived at over the course of time in a number of public meetings. But now that we're actually pursuing this particular plan, again, we wanted to engage the community some more, provide more information. Nothing is carved in stone yet. We are pursuing this particular proposal, but there's a lot of things that we can only really get the details on as we continue to pursue it down the road. So the purpose of today's meeting is to engage in an exchange of questions and facts. We understand that folks are going to have opinions or already have opinions with respect to the current proposal, but what we really want to focus on here today, because this is a special meeting, there are lots of meetings that we have where people come and express our opinions, typically every Tuesday night at about 7:10. We have a section in our regular council meeting for questions and comments of a general nature, and we hear comments from people and opinions from people on all kinds of things. So there will be many opportunities, have been, are, and will be opportunities for public comment with respect to opinions. What we really want to focus on here today, like we did on Thursday, is providing information so that it forms a basis for an opinion. So we really want to focus on if you have factual questions as to how much is this, how many square footage is this going to be, where is this going over there, how much is that going to cost, where's the dollars coming from this and that source. Those are all great factual questions. We're going to try to stay away from, well, I don't like the way that building's designed, or I don't think this should be there. Trust me, we're not trying to discourage you from sharing those opinions, but there'll be other opportunities for it. Really what we want to do here today is make sure that there's information that's provided about what this proposal is all about. And on that note, let me ask very quickly, how many of you came here today with your minds made up and you're absolutely against this proposal no matter what you hear today? By show of hands. Nobody put their hand up. That's great. Let me turn around the other way. How many people here, by show of hands, have already made up their minds and think this is the absolutely best proposal we should pursue and we should do it no matter what? All right, got a couple people think that's a really good idea, but most of you have come here and you want to hear more about it. and want to receive information upon which you can base your opinion. And I think that's important because this is a project that has a lot of different pieces to it. And if things change, I think that could change any one of our opinions, including the folks that are sitting behind me. But based on the information we have right now, this is the proposal that we are pursuing. So that's the purpose of today's meeting. We're going to have a brief presentation from Deputy Village Manager Mike Baker. It's going to be brief on purpose because what we really want to do again is provide information, hear your questions, both from the folks that are in the audience here today, as well as folks who are going to be emailing things in from outside. And then we're going to do our best to provide answers. I think we're going to have probably most of them based on Thursday night. We'll be able to answer right here. If not, we certainly can provide those answers later, but that's really what this is about. On behalf of myself and all my colleagues, we really appreciate you taking time out of your Saturday morning, busy Saturday mornings, to come down here and learn more about this. We're obviously going to be around long after this meeting, all of us, and are very happy to answer questions. So with that, I am going to, number one, remind all those who are watching at home that after the presentation from Mr. Baker, feel free to email in questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can in the time allotted. I think we're going to try to keep the proceedings to about 2 hours-ish, but we certainly don't want to cut off questions if they're still coming in. So with that, let me introduce Deputy Village Manager Mike Baker. He is going to give a very brief presentation on the current proposal that we are pursuing, and I think that'll help set the table for the factual discussion that we'll have here today. Again, thank you. And for the cameras, rather than wandering around like Phil Donahue and asking you questions, I am going to go back up so that everyone at home can see me and hear me. And when you have questions here in the audience, I'm going to put this microphone back in the stand. There's another one on the other side. If you wouldn't mind, please come up to the microphone and ask your questions. Again, it's for the benefit of the folks at home, otherwise they just won't hear you. And we want to make sure that they hear your questions like you will hear their questions when we read them from email, so that everybody can get the benefit of the same Q&A. Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mayor. It occurs to me, for all the times I've been in this room, for all the times I've presented in this room, this is the first time I've actually had my back to the council. Obviously, as the mayor said, the purpose here is to engage you, the audience, the people that have turned out, to gather information, to ask questions, and that's just what we're going to do. I am going to keep my comments very brief. There's a lot that I could go into great detail about, but we can get into some of that with questions as we get further on. Obviously, most of you were on the tours, and through this whole project and this effort, we have known issues that we have to do something about, that the challenges that we faced for many years only become more problematic as we go forward, as new requirements, new changes, new expectations occur. And so, you know, the issue should have been readily apparent as you looked through those buildings. We have old systems that need repair and replacement. We have operational challenges, particularly over at the police station, the size of that facility. The location, specifically for fleet maintenance and for the police, has some problems with it. We are sitting on an 8.2 acre piece of property right here in the heart of the downtown that has no taxable value attached to it because, obviously, it's public property. And as I mentioned, community expectations over the years, since we began occupying these buildings, the late 60s for Village Hall, the late 70s for police, have changed dramatically for the kinds of services that the community wants us to provide. In addition to making tours available, we try to make that, provide some illustration on our website through picture galleries that illustrate where this occurs and provide some description of exactly what's happening within these buildings, Village Hall and police station. These are just a few of them right now, but there are many more on our website if you haven't had a chance to look at those. As the mayor said, this has been a process that we've spent quite a bit of time investing in and understanding, and particularly looking at the options. We've looked at options for maintaining the uses on this site. We've looked at rehabbing and modernizing the existing buildings. And we've looked at alternatives, and that's what you're going to hear primarily in the rest of my presentation, is the concept plan that we're working with now and trying to advance and doing further due diligence on, which is a two-phased approach that looks at the use of other property throughout the village. Ultimately, the goal is to come up with a solution that allows us to provide municipal facilities in a long-term and sustainable manner. So I'll touch on the land use plan, the benefits of each phase of the plan, and the financial plan. And again, this is just a very brief overview of these aspects. So these are the three properties in town that I'll be referencing as I go through the land use plan. The Civic Center site, obviously, where we are right now, the parcel at Ogden Avenue and Lacey Road, which is currently vacant, and Fire Station number 1 site. We'll start with the Civic Center site. Obviously, here we are, police station, village hall, fleet maintenance facility, as you have all seen. What we would initially propose to do as the first phase is to relocate the police station and the fleet maintenance facility off of this location to an alternate site. And that site is the 9.8 acre parcel at Ogden Avenue and Lacey Road. It's currently owned by the Aldi Corporation, which of course would require acquisition, ultimately by the village for the piece of property that we own for municipal facilities. So the relocation of these two functions from this site to that piece of property might look something like this, just to show you how we would occupy that parcel. Actually, it's two parcels. The combined facility, police station and fleet maintenance, would also house Fire Station number 1. Currently in the Ellsworth Business Park, would be relocated to this site for a number of reasons, but primarily because it would allow us to improve response times overall throughout the village, particularly to the northwest area up by the Esplanade and Butterfield Road, where we have a hard time meeting those response times now, and allow us to still maintain response times to the other areas on the west side of the village. This would allow for the installation of a traffic signal at Ogden and Lacey, providing access to the site, especially for those public safety vehicles. And there would be a portion of the property, about 3 to 3.5 acres, that could be designated for commercial use right along the Ogden Avenue corridor. Again, some of the benefits of this phase of the plan: it does resolve our operational challenges in those buildings that we're able to construct new facilities. It improves fire and EMS response times, develops that portion of the corridor with commercial use. Because of the presence of the traffic signal, particularly, is likely to spur further redevelopment in that part of Ogden, and improves traffic safety and flow in the neighborhood to the north, the Burlington Highlands neighborhood. So that's the first phase of the plan. The second phase then comes back onto this site that we're on now. Obviously, we've relocated the police station and fleet maintenance facility. And we would look at a redevelopment scenario for this piece of property in an attempt to try to put most of it back on the tax rolls. The village hall would require a small portion of the site, and it might look something like this, with the village hall to the west, in closer proximity to the downtown, and the rest of the property designated for what we believe most desirable would be a multifamily residential development. Some of the benefits of this phase: creates a transit-oriented development site here in the downtown in close proximity to a very well-traveled metro station. It improves traffic safety and flow at Burlington and Washington. I didn't point this out, but let me show you right here. We would be able, as part of this redevelopment, to look at scenarios that allow us to realign and improve pedestrian and vehicular safety at that intersection and grade crossing, which we know is problematic for anybody who takes the train or has to come through that part of town in the early morning or late afternoon hours. We eliminate risks, obviously, because we relocated the police station, which has challenges in proximity to the railroad now. The mayor alluded to this. We'd have the potential to create partnerships with other governments and nonprofits. Obviously, we'd be constructing a new building on this site, and this would, since it would be the second phase of the project, would give us time to have conversations with other entities that might be interested in working with the village, increasing the size of the space to allow us to serve multiple needs out of one a municipal facility. And obviously this, in combination with the first phase, reduces the number of facilities and the overall footprint that the village currently occupies right now on property in Downers Grove. The financial plan, I have a very brief summary here. There is quite a bit more information on our website, especially in a memo that we prepared that goes into detail, especially about the sources of funding for this project. But the total cost for both phases is estimated at $52 million. Here's how we propose to pay for it. Starting with the first phase, you can see the sources of funding listed here: drug seizure funds, funding from the Ogden Avenue TIF, and other existing revenues that could be dedicated to this phase of the project. So this represents about $20 million in sources of funding that we have available and can be used for the project. It would still leave $18 million to be identified through grants, other sources of revenue, or ultimately the tax levy. Phase 2 of the project, about $14 million, we believe could be paid for by revenues generated from the development on this site. The sale of land and taxes that are generated from that development project could be pledged to the construction of the Village Hall facility. And again, one of the unique attributes of the way this project was put together is that it allows us to use those revenues in this manner to help fund facility construction. So again, that's a very brief overview, but we did want to allow ample time for questions and for discussion, and are happy to get into much more detail depending on the interests of people that are here today or people that email questions in. We'll make sure to respond to every question that comes up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker, and we're glad to know that we actually have some people watching from home, because we have received one email question already.
Two now.
Two already have come in. So if you see us looking at the phones, it's because, or the tablets, it's not that we're ignoring anybody, we're checking for email questions. A couple of questions come. Why don't we just start with those two, and we'll give the folks in the audience here opportunity to come up with even more questions. The first question basically asks, with respect to the parcel at Ogden and Lee, is that property contaminated, and or has any testing been done of the site with respect to the issue of contamination? And the answer is yes and yes, and for more detail on that, I will turn it over to Mr. Baker.
Mm-hmm. Yes is the answer. There is known contamination on the site. As many people are aware, the site used to be an old automobile junkyard. Work was done in the early 2000s. I believe a report completed in 2002 by the EPA that extensively studied the site and looked at where that contamination existed. When a development project came forward in 2007, again, further work was completed to look at the extent of the environmental contamination. So we have a good understanding and record that exist and show us where that contamination exists and what is necessary to be done to remediate it. We've been working closely with the Environmental Protection Agency to assist with these efforts, and we know that there are grant funds available for the assessment and cleanup of the environmental contamination on that site.
Is there a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Just a real quick follow-up.
Sir, can we ask you to use a microphone for those at home?
Sure, no problem. I think we're going to end up going Phil Donahue style with this one.
That's all right, I can get up, I need the exercise, thank you. Just a quick follow-up question on that. You mentioned that the EPA, you were working with the EPA and you knew the regulations, but if I remember right, I think the last year that you mentioned that you were working with them was 2012? 2007
2007
okay.
was the last time.
And so I guess my question is, do you know, have the regulations changed, since obviously the EPA regulations change pretty dramatically from year to year, so how current is that?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have recently spoken with the IEPA just a couple of weeks ago, and we've learned that the regulations have changed, but in this particular case, the cleanup standard has been lessened because the previous development proposal had residential units on it. And under the EPA guidelines, the cleanup objectives were more stringent if you have people living on the site. We verified and we understand and know what the cleanup standards would be, and we factored that into our planning and budgets.
I'm going to come out and be Phil Donahue after all. Other questions from the audience?
We also...
We did have, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry to interrupt. We also had another question regarding the parking at the Civic Center. Will the parking be changed for the Main Street Metro Station if we proceed with this plan and move some of these land uses to Ogden Avenue? The answer to that is most likely it will have to change if we implement this plan because we will reconfigure the Civic Center site. The Civic Center site now has a component for commuter parking and downtown parking located on it. If we place a new Village Hall on the far west side of this property, that's right where that parking is located. So we will have to at least relocate that parking. We would be working with Metra to make sure we meet their requirements for commuter parking and to make sure that there is some level of commuter parking still part of the development program when we reconfigure the site.
Can council ask a question?
Yes.
I have a follow-up question to that, Dave. Majority of the lots are Metro lots. Does the existing Metro lots along the rail have the same rules and regulations towards this lot that you just referenced? Or is it more village controlled versus what the rail lots are? And rail lots, I mean those that are along the railroad tracks.
Most of the property along the railroad track that is not part of the Civic Center site is either owned or controlled by the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad or Metra through a variety of leases, agreements, et cetera. The property that we're talking about, the Civic Center site, is owned and controlled by the Village of Downers Grove. However, there are some parking resources, areas that we use for commuter parking, that relate to an overall agreement we have with Metra regarding the number of commuter parking spaces that are provided for the Main Street campus. So we have direct control over the land and land use at this location, and we have to work with Metra to make sure we make good on our obligations to provide commuter parking. And of course, we would want to continue to provide commuter parking for our community as well.
And with that said, have we begun the discussions with Metra to make sure that there's no possible way that they, being a no vote or not agree with our desire to redevelop that and remove or move around the parking? Have we started those conversations with Metra?
Yes, we have. You may recall that a couple of years ago, we put together a downtown parking plan. And one of the key recommendations there was to relook at the location and mix of commuter parking. So we actually started that conversation a couple of years ago as part of a different project. We re-looked at it and had another conversation with Metra when the platform construction started again last year. We'll take up again next year. And we're meeting with them again on the same topic as it relates here. So the bottom line is we are in constant communication with Metra and the Burlington Northern to make sure we're all on the same page for commuter parking.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Sure thing. As questions come up, just raise your hand. I'll come and find you. Everyone's still mulling over some questions. You get to go again? I'll be right there.
Two other follow-up questions, if I could, please. If I remember right, back on the slides, you mentioned that moving the fire station would increase response time. By moving it, wouldn't it by definition also decrease response time in some other areas? So that's the first question. I don't know, you want me to go right into the second, or do you want to answer that one first?
I'll take a shot at the first question there. Obviously, if you relocate any fire station, there are areas that have increased response times and areas that have decreased response times. What we want is to have response times that are low, fast. Our target is 4 to 6 minutes. The idea here is if we relocate from Fire Station 1 from the Ellsworth Business Park to Ogden and Lacey, then the areas of town on the far northwest side that do not generally fall within our 6-minute response time, they are longer. That area would come into compliance with our standard of about 4 to 6 minutes. Now, the area immediately surrounding Fire Station 1 would remain within our 4 to 6 minute response time. So we look at it as an overall system. Right now we have areas that are not within our standard. If we make the move, all of the areas in town that are in play here would come into compliance within our standard. But the response times immediately next to a station are always better than the response times further away.
Sure, perfect.
Thank you. The other question I have is regarding the multifamily dwelling proposal for downtown. Has there been a study also what impact that has in the community as far as schools, if you're bringing in more people, et cetera, in a more dense area, as well as the traffic impact there and parking?
Not a specific study yet on the issues of community impacts, not specific to a development proposal on this site. However, in general, when we prepared our comprehensive plan, we did look at those issues on a broader scale of what we wanted our downtown to look like, what kind of land uses. And this plan is consistent with our comprehensive plan of trying to bring transit-oriented development, multifamily uses. They cater to primarily a young, informed workforce that may be riding the train to and from employment centers like Chicago. We think that the impact to the schools would be minimal, and in fact, there's a development proposal that's pending on Maple Avenue where we just received an impact study that confirms through that report that these types of developments have low impacts on school, or expected to have low impacts on schools. We'll continue to work with the school districts if this, as this plan proceeds. Regarding traffic, if you put 200 or more multifamily residential units in this area, yes, there will be substantially more traffic in and around the neighborhood. That being said, these types of developments don't typically have the same traffic generation as multifamily developments outside of a downtown and not next to train stations. So, yes, there will be traffic impacts. As this plan proceeds and a particular proposal is put together, then we will go through and actually have a specific study on the school impacts and traffic impacts.
Hey, Dave, could you touch a little bit on Fire Station 1 and you talked about response times, but also the sort of the load leveling aspect relative to 3?
Yes. Right now, the village operates 4 stations throughout the village, and the ideal situation is that you would have each station handle about 25% of your call volume. That is not really the case that we have right now. Station 1 handles the lowest amount of calls, about 12.5%. Station 3, located on the north side of the tracks next to Good Samaritan Hospital, is our busiest station, handling about 38% of our call volume. If we were to proceed with this relocation, Fire Station 1 would receive more of the calls, and the impact on Fire Station 3 would be reduced, getting closer to the desired state of 25% of the call volume in each of the 4 stations.
One of the things that happens there is you get, when a fire team is responding to a call, they're of course not available for the next one. And so is there magic behind 25%? Not necessarily, except for that you'd like to maximize the availability of that fire station at all times. And so if they're going to be on calls. And so if you can sort of level that out, the inverse is true then too. They're also more available for the calls in their immediate areas.
Thanks, sir.
Hi. I've got actually 3 questions I can think of, all unrelated. Is part of the plan at Ogden and Lacey to complete the sidewalks along there, at least as part of that property goes, maybe even extending to all the way up and down Ogden Avenue?
Yes, the plan would include construction of sidewalk across the Ogden Avenue frontage in this location. But on a broader topic of completion of the sidewalk system along Ogden, earlier this year, the council did approve a concept plan of how to complete the sidewalk system on Ogden in the next several years, and we identified some funding sources. So yes to this site, and yes over the next several years for the whole system.
Can I add just something real quick, Jack? There's, you can see up there that circle is a traffic signal right at Lacey. So I think you live in that area, so there will be some increased pedestrian access, from one side of Ogden to the other, which will actually in turn help getting pedestrians back and forth across Ogden to where the sidewalk segments will be. With the proposed commercial frontage there on Ogden too, it'll be a nice way to, if somebody is at Beard's getting their car fixed and they need to walk across the street and maybe go to the hot dog store or whatever might move in there, maybe a really big hot dog store, who knows, Portillo's south. We could call Mr. Portillo and ask him to do that for us. I am hungry, actually.
Well, and as somebody who had to teach 2 teenagers to drive, and the first thing they had to do is make a left on Ogden Avenue coming out of the neighborhood, I was like, oh geez. Well, if you can do this, you're pretty well set as a young driver. Anyway, Oh, the other couple of questions was, as far as environmental remediation, is that mostly soil removal, contaminated soil removal and replacement, or is there something more complicated going on there?
The good news is that it appears from the studies that the contamination is limited to the soil and has not become a groundwater issue. That's important because if it gets into the groundwater, it can move through underground water. So the studies reveal that it's in the soil. There's a couple different ways that it could be remediated. One is the way that you talked about, which is to actually take the contaminated soil, pull it off the site, place it in a special waste hauling landfill. The other way is to actually cover it up and contain it with what they call engineered barriers. Keep it on site but protect it from impacting people. Engineered barrier is a fancy word for things like asphalt and concrete and plastic liners. We don't have a specific plan that we're proceeding with yet. All indications are it will be a combination of some haul and removal and some manage on site with engineered barriers.
Okay. And the third question was, you talked about transit-oriented development in the downtown. Moving the police station out to Ogden Avenue reduces the ability to access it from public transportation. I wonder if that's been a concern.
Actually, we have not had that question before. That's a great question we'd like to look into to see how many of our customers would be arriving and using police station services from the train. So that's something we'd like to get back to you on. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to pause for a second, I want to remind, just one second, just want to remind those who are watching at home, if you have questions or comments and you want to join the conversation, please email them in. There is the email address of Mayor and Council, which will come to all of us, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. We appreciate those who have already sent in some questions. As you follow along with the conversation today, if you have follow-up questions or other questions, please email them in, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. We don't have a 1-800 number like 1-800-NEW-HAUL or something like that, so we're using email. We're being very 21st century. The hashtag would be good. Commissioner?
There is another question, but just to add on to Jack's last question about the transit-oriented development, could we also look at if there's any connection to the Pace route that comes through on Main Street and how that affects connection to the police department and its uses and services?
Yes, we will. Mayor, we just had another couple of questions come in. This one, first question involving impacts to the area around the Ogden and Lacey piece, particularly Grant Avenue between Stonewall and Lee. Do our plans call for this street becoming a through street? The answer is no. We do not plan to have any off-site changes, especially into the neighborhood to the south there. So no plans to change anything about Grant between Stonewall and Lee. The next question is there a plan to include a southern access road from the Aldi lot or the property in question to Grant Avenue? The answer is no. The preliminary plans that we've thought about and sketched out and are shown here would have all access going directly and only onto Ogden Avenue. There will probably be at least 2 access points from the subject site to Ogden Avenue, but no direct connection to Grant or any of the other side streets at this point. Further questions is regarding environmental impact to residential, nearby residences, people who live next to this site. And here they're talking about not environmental in the aspect of the soil, but the impacts like garbage truck noise, lights at night, sirens, those kind of things. If you're living next to a public safety building, he's asking us to please address those concerns. Those are concerns in any neighborhood where we put public safety facilities, including police stations and fire stations. The good news is we have a long history of operating public safety in residential neighborhoods. Most of our public safety buildings are in residential neighborhoods. And we try to minimize through our operations the impacts, especially with sirens, lights, et cetera, noise. We're considerate of those neighbors. For example, most of the time when responding to a fire call, we do not run lights and sirens unless there's a need to, because there's traffic right next door or traffic on the street we're trying to get out. And I think, Mayor, you may have some comments on that as well, having living very close to the new fire station too. But in general, all of these issues, it is our intent through screening, through how we design the facility once we get that far, and how we operate to minimize any negative impacts on the surrounding residents in this neighborhood.
And just to pick up on that question, there's two other pieces to add. One, once upon a time, and I don't recall if it was 5 years ago, 4 years ago, there was a proposal to put a mixed-use residential commercial project into the Ogden-Lacey location. Ultimately, for a lot of reasons, that it remains fallow today and empty, that project didn't work out. We have some experience with dealing with and addressing and talking to the neighbors around that at the time because of the proposed development, and albeit it was residential and commercial, not a public building and commercial. We are very familiar with some of the concerns and issues that were raised by folks in that neighborhood about anything going into the Ogden and Lacey parcel. That's number one, and certainly we'll continue to address those and be sensitive to them. Number two, I can speak from personal experience living right across the street from Fire Station Number 2, that it really hasn't been an issue largely because of the comments that Dave made, which is the sirens are usually not run until they're away from the residential area, and you really don't notice the lights very much. The only question I have is, are we planning on putting a tornado siren at the new fire station on Ogden and Lacey? That's about the only thing you can't get away from. When those get tested at 10 o'clock in the morning, the first Tuesday every month, yes, you notice it. But the good news is, you're supposed to notice it. That's the whole idea of a tornado siren.
We have not looked at relocating outdoor severe weather warning sirens. That would be a detail we would address as we move forward. The current locations are working. There are siren and outdoor warning devices located very close to the Civic Center site, so we will look into that as we move forward.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
First, I wanted to say that for the new development out in that northwest part of town, have they offered a challenge as to when they're moving in or looking at building there, the response time has been an issue? I can see that if this, having the fire station and the police station up on Ogden would be an advantage to possibly community development. We're closer to your buildings, things like that. That's number one, if you could answer that, if there's been any concern. Number two, on the multi-use facility downtown, I think as you build that, the funding, are you already looking at current buildings that are there now based on taxes, et cetera? Number one, and number two, do you have any other builders that have already approached you that are looking at that area should you we decide to do this?
Great questions. Regarding the concern for the existing response times in the northwest portion of our village, yes, from a review of data and the actual response times that we've had over the last several years, there's a concern in that they are oftentimes beyond the 6 minutes that we're looking for. Have we received any particular complaints from those who we're providing service to? We'll check on that. I don't recall any off the top of my head, but we will check with the fire department on that. I do also want to point out that we do mitigate the risk of fire by the way those buildings are designed and built. Those office buildings and the new residential building behind Home Depot are equipped with modern fire suppression systems, alarm systems, detection systems, and so the risk of fire is mitigated through building design in those scenarios. As far as funding for the downtown and the impact on existing buildings and existing taxpayers, one of the best attributes of this plan is the concept that we hope that through the sale of land to the multifamily developer of a portion of the site, the sale of land, plus the property taxes generated only from the new multifamily residential development, by capturing those two revenue sources, it is our hope that we could pay for up to all of the costs of the new village hall. Now, we'll have to make sure that that is the case, but certainly in any case, it would pay for a majority of the expense of any new village hall. It is our intent to minimize the impact on existing taxpayers, especially in that Phase 2 component. Have we been approached by any developers or developers talked to us about this opportunity? Yes, you can imagine that once this plan went public, there are all sorts of very qualified residential developers throughout the Chicago region and frankly throughout the nation that have been reaching out to us. What's the schedule? How do we get in on this? That kind of question. So we think the demand is there, and we think the opportunity to work with high-quality developers who can build a high-quality residential development to our expectations is a high likelihood.
Thanks for that question. And let's go to one that came in from email. This was a question we heard on Thursday. It was a question, as I understand it, is number one, asking for what's the square footage of the proposed new facilities. We have a red square up there right now that says combined facility, police station, fire station 1, and fleet maintenance. What are the square footages of, contemplated square footages of each of those? That's question number one. And then how does it relate to the site and with all the other colored shapes up there? Are those square footages really enough to address the functionality issues that we currently have on site, if I'm relating the question properly?
Thank you, Mayor. The subject site, as Mr. Baker told us, is about 9.8 acres. This is the site at Ogden and Lacey. We have done some initial space planning. By no means have we started the design of any particular building, but we do have some idea of our space needs. And what you see here is 3 land uses on Ogden and Lacey. A commercial component that could be about 3 acres. A stormwater component and stormwater management area that could be about 3 acres. And the balance of the site for a combined municipal facility. We estimate that if we go forward with all 3 components of that facility, it could be somewhere around 80, 90,000 square feet, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. We have done some sketches with an architect that show that if we put that building in a 2-story format and take advantage of the grades of that site, which are undulating at that point, then it does fit and it does. It goes up and down.
Thank you.
Thank you, sorry. Can't take the planner out of me, I apologize for that. But if we put it in a 2-story configuration, that 80 to 90,000 square feet will not only address our operating concerns, as Mike mentioned earlier, but should fit comfortably on that site.
Thank you. Sir?
I have 2 statements and 1 question. One statement is I have never heard a village official say, I want to build a village hall that's smaller. They're usually larger. Secondly, if you have not gone through the police department, you really need to see how bad that is. It's really bad shape. And the question is, by moving the fire station over to Ogden, does that change our ISO rating?
Let's start with the comment about Village Hall. Yes, the plan calls for taking a rather large and very inefficient former ball bearing factory that we're in now and actually building a smaller facility that's much more efficient. So yes, we're very proud that we can hopefully get into a much smaller square footage there. As far as the impact of the ISO rating of the relocation of Fire Station 1, the answer is it can only help as we address some response times needs. Earlier this year, we did receive an improvement in our ISO rating from a 3 to a 2, which saves business owners quite a bit of money on their fire insurance costs throughout the village. We will continue to work to get to the ultimate goal of ISO rating of number 1, and we're getting closer every day, and we'll continue to work with ISO on those issues.
Thank you. Sir?
Yes, Dave, and I think you touched on it a little bit. I see in the drawing for the plans on Ogden Avenue that stormwater detention is in there, and I think you said it was about 3 acres. Because obviously the infrastructure for stormwater in the Downers Grove area is in need of dire repair and upgrades, and you do have quite a bit of property, basically 2/3 of the area. Has there been any consideration for the homes in neighborhoods to the west and south on how that's going to impact and how that flow into the stormwater detention is going to impact them as well?
The short answer is yes, we have looked at the impacts of the current situation with stormwater issues, and we should be making a design that will not only address the stormwater concerns on this site, but should make the stormwater management in the immediate area a little bit better. I want to be clear, though, this is not designed to be a regional detention basin to solve regional challenges of stormwater in the area. But the real issue here is that this site in question that is currently served with very old farmers' field tiles, those field tiles are failing. And so if we do nothing on this site, stormwater gets worse and does start to negatively impact, especially the houses to the south and to the west, to the east. In general, any development here at all would help that because we'd have to modernize that, put in detention facilities, replace the functionality of those old farmers' tiles. To address stormwater in this area and to alleviate flooding concerns and the impact to residential properties, the village just did acquire several single-family homes that were located on the east side of Lee Street from Ogden Avenue down to Grant and Lee Park, and we did demolish those houses to make sure that those houses weren't subject to flooding. So that area will permanently be used just to accommodate stormwater in large storm events.
Question that I'll ask from the other night. What is the estimated cost of the environmental remediation of the Ogden and Lee parcel, and how sure are we that that number is accurate?
Our current estimates for the environmental remediation are somewhere in the range of about $1 million. The actual cost will depend on the type of remediation activity that we choose and is allowable under the type of development we have going forward. We want to make sure that any number we put out as far as a budget or cost estimate at this point, which is very early in the process, is a number that's very realistic. So we spent a lot of time working with a variety of sources to make sure not only the remediation expense budget, but all the expenses are accurate. So we really had several sources. Number one, we worked with a local resident who happens to own a construction cost estimating firm, one of the best in the country. They volunteered their time and helped us review our cost estimates. Number two, we did engage an architect to help us with initial project vision and some space planning ideas that I mentioned earlier. That architect also did weigh in on our cost estimates, helped us put together a budget. Number three, we reviewed information and consulted with the environmental engineering firms that are familiar with the Ogden and Lacey site and have worked on projects, especially the one back in 2007, where they prepared a remediation plan and cost estimate at that time. We did look at those figures, we did contact them and revisit, in fact, two of them. And we also ran the cost estimates by the Illinois EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So those numbers have been looked at from a variety of sources. And then we did what I like to call the gut check, the reality check. We went and looked at other public safety and public buildings that have been built in northern Illinois in the last handful of years. And we found that these cost estimates are right in line and at this point are conservative.
Thank you. We have another question from our studio audience. Sir?
Thank you. After taking that tour of the police station, it is certainly very obsolete. I'm not sure how they functioned in there 25 years ago. But having said that, I think it was a very forward-thinking plan. You've done your due diligence. I like the plan. I think it's necessary, especially for the police station. But being that it's 25 years old, can we expect that the next plan, the next police station, we will have to revisit this in 25 years and it's $150 million?
Yes. That's a great question. The current police station was built in 1979. Some of our police leadership joined our force in the mid-1980s, and they're still here, and they can speak to what that building was like just a few years after it was built. That building was built just before the changes in how we use computers and computer technology. So back then, we really missed that by a couple of years, and we did not do a great job of anticipating technology changes and how that would affect policing and other service provision. One thing we've gotten much better at, I think all of us in the construction industry, is just being more ready to handle changes that we can't see coming forward now. So building spaces that can change, literally movable walls, open spaces, flexible spaces, considering how modern workers work from home, work from any place using tablets, all those things will be in all these buildings as we proceed, with the hope that we don't really constrain ourselves and end up with a useful life that is short. We would expect 30 to 50 years from these buildings, hopefully more on the 50-year side. But this is an issue that I think everybody's dealing with, the office sector, commercial sectors, what have you. So we'll learn from them, and we'll try to minimize the impact of a short life of any of these buildings.
Let's not forget, too, that in 1979, I think Chief Porter may have been around then. Well, you were around in the area. I don't
think he was born yet.
I was only 4 years old, but I think our community has grown significantly, both in residential and commercial use since then. It's a really good question, Mr. Crane, because as our community has grown since 1979 till today, the if we take a quick ride around town or even do an aerial shot, and our map back there actually might be a good depiction of it, there isn't a whole heck of a lot of more developable space in Downers Grove. So to say that we're completely built out is not accurate, but we're pretty close to being, at a level of capacity for residential and commercial use. Now, I just said that, and we're contemplating putting another 200 folks here on this parcel. But I think we know where we are as far as size of staff. We have done a lot of work in this village to create a lean environment and a lean management style where we have the right people doing the right things. We talked about Elton Brown doing multiple things with a whisk or a turkey fryer or whatever it might be. We have staff members here that are cross-trained from department to department. And what that allows us to do is, as you walk through this building, you saw a lot of open and empty cubes and space because our workforce is mobile. And I think that's not just a trend here in our village, but that's a national trend. And it's as easy as taking one of these with you and going to Public Works or one of the fire stations or even to the police department. Speaking of mobility, our fleet services department, I think one of the best things that ever happened was that everything in that room, everything in that garage back there is mobile. From obviously the toolboxes that the mechanics use to literally the lifts that can lift up a bus, a fire truck, a snowplow truck. It's all mobile. So it can be easily moved, which means that the equipment doesn't need to be purchased for the new building. The lifts can go with, the tools go with, pretty much everything just goes right over to the new building and moves right in. So the mobility and the change in our workforce and the change in our style and leadership here at the Village Hall and all the other departments allows us to, I think, right-size these buildings. So we have that in mind, but we also know that where we are right now is a pretty good spot. Not to say that that could never change in the future, but I think with the technology upgrades, we'll go from Cat5 wires down to fiber in the buildings and have a lot more access via those kind of technology upgrades. Thank you for that good question.
Thanks.
Before we move forward, I wanted to jump back real quick to the, if you don't mind.
No.
To the Ogden Avenue TIF and the remediation. There was some discussion during the Thursday night meeting of the $6 million number that was on the slide. And you mentioned earlier that the remediation estimate was about $1 million. Could you tell us what else goes into that $6 million?
Yes, the $6 million from the Ogden TIF could be used for certain expenses related to the entire Ogden Avenue development. The budget we have for the project would call for the use of almost all of that $6 million for things like land acquisition and site development. What do we mean by site development? Really want to use those funds to address the concerns we've heard about and are known on the site, the environmental remediation, managing the existing wetlands that are on the site. They are low-quality wetlands that we would be allowed to mitigate and move into that stormwater management area. The construction and installation of the traffic signal, the stormwater management facilities, all of those things, that's what we would use the TIF funds for primarily, including the price of buying the property.
Thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Before we take another question from the studio audience, we did have a question that came in from someone watching remotely, and thank you for the question. It has a couple pieces to it. First, have you looked at the traffic impact on the residential areas around the Ogden development? This is related to something we were talking about earlier. And I think the short answer, if I remember correctly from earlier, is we haven't done a specific traffic study yet. That would certainly be part of any project going forward. I don't know if we mentioned, or this is a good point in time to discuss the proposed traffic signal that would be put in place in conjunction with this project. So I'll throw that one to the village manager in a second. The other question was, at the Ogden site, with respect to the commercial segment that was shown in blue earlier, what type of retail development are you looking for? Mm-hmm. And I think the answer there is, this is very much in flux. There are a number of different options that could present themselves in terms of the type of commercial land there. Mr. Fieldman can comment a little bit more about some of the options there in terms of either how that would work into the overall financing of the project. There are some other options, which I want to come back to a little bit later, about partnering with other entities in terms of intergovernmental cooperation. We touched upon that earlier. I want to come back to that later. But the other question I know that Commissioner Barnett's going to be asked by somebody in here is, why can't we develop this parcel? What's wrong with it, and why can't we get it developed? So we'll hang on to that one a little bit later. So we'll start with, first of all, traffic impact.
Traffic
Ogden
impact.
and Lee, the commercial, what we anticipate for the commercial portion, and then why can't we develop the whole parcel?
Let's start with the traffic impact. The same answer applies to this site as it was applied to the downtown site. We have not done a specific traffic impact study because we don't have a particular proposal yet, especially as it relates to the commercial or retail component. However, through our comprehensive planning efforts from a couple of years ago, we did identify this site as an area that we wanted commercial activity, and it is planned for that Ogden Avenue can accommodate additional commercial development in this area. It's one of our goals. I do want to reiterate that the plan does not call for a direct connection to the residential streets to the south, not a connection to Stonewall or Lee at this time. So we're always cognizant of the impact of developments on residential neighborhoods, and we'll try to mitigate any impacts there. What kind of commercial development are we looking for? You know, we're always looking for the kind of commercial development that generates retail sales tax. We depend on retail sales tax as one of our major revenue streams to help us provide service. It says commercial, though, not specifically retail. While we hope to get retail development, retail opportunities in this area can be a little limited. The area that would be served by the retailers in the surrounding 1 mile or 3 mile area, the areas that commercial and retail developers look for, happens to include a very large area of open space where no people live, Hidden Lakes Forest Preserve and the Morton Arboretum. It's one of the largest areas where nobody lives in all of DuPage County because it's just a preserve of trees and a great asset for our communities in the area. However, that does affect the viability of retail on the western portions of Ogden Avenue. That's why when you look at the development patterns on Ogden Avenue, most of the hard retail, the ones that generate quite a bit of sales tax, are located further east. We hope that the development we're planning, including the traffic signal, would spur retail development and be more likely to locate here. We've been working with the Downers Grove Economic Development Corporation to pursue retailers that may be interested in this area. So what does that mean as far as what can we actually expect? This sets up for outlot type development or strip center type development that you see up and down Ogden Avenue. So something like the Starbucks that was just constructed at Saratoga and Ogden, I think that's kind of what we're looking at. Quick serve restaurants in smaller buildings, those kinds of things.
Portillo's.
We'll have to call Mr. Portillo real quickly to see if he's interested in this site.
Knock on his door.
The other thing, though, that we're working on is one of our strengths on this segment of Ogden Avenue is automobile dealerships, new automobile dealerships. We're working with the Economic Development Corporation to see if there is a new auto dealership that would need between 3 and 4 acres. And if we can partner with them, that would be great, because I think that would be a great fit as far as layout. There's more flexibility in the design, shared parking opportunities, all sorts of things. And we know it's a strength, and the retail corridor of that auto row there stretches almost to the site already. So that's like the best, I think, with something we're targeting, but I think the expectation is a combination of commercial and retail of a smaller scale.
Can I jump in for a second? So I remember Michael Cass, and maybe you can explain this better. Michael Cass is the head of our EDC. He talked about how retail uses, there's like a circle of the visitors that a circle of area that they hope that those customers come from. And that because of your reference to that there's not many people living there, that's why it's not attractive at this point to grocery stores and things like that, because of that circle.
Correct.
Did I explain that right?
I think it's right on. The neighborhood-type commercial, like grocery stores and those kind of service-oriented retailers, that 1 mile radius is very important to them. How many people live within 1 mile of the retail center? And while obviously the portions of Downers Grove have strong residential within that 1 mile and would shop there, that the Morton Arboretum and Hidden Lakes Forest Preserve, there's nobody living there. So the type of retail you're going to get here does not lend itself to grocery stores and other neighborhood service type retail. It does do well, though, with retail uses that depend heavily on peak morning and afternoon traffic. Being on the south side of the street, this would lean towards customers in the morning rush hour heading east.
two questions. First, north of the Main Street train station, there's an unfinished residential development. It's been unfinished for several years. The fact that they can't finish that residential development, what makes us think we can have more residential development on this parcel?
That particular site has had challenges unique to that developer and that site, and it started before the Great Recession, and obviously the west portion of that site stopped. Those are very urban-style townhomes or condos. In consultation with the EDC and the development community, we think the market that exists now and should exist for several years into the future is for apartment units, for rent units in a mid-rise location of a size that's at least 150 units in the development. We think the market there is viable and much different than the type of product that's under construction, or will be under construction again shortly on the north side.
Okay, my second question relates to the vehicle maintenance. I'm surprised Public Works does not have any type of vehicle maintenance performed there, with the fact that the village bus service is disbanded. We don't have the buses there anymore. Would it make more sense to have the vehicle maintenance, fleet maintenance operations at Public Works?
Yes, that would make great sense. Most of the vehicles we service, or a great portion of them, are housed at the Public Works building. Unfortunately, there's not enough space there to do the types of maintenance activities that many of those vehicles require, especially the lifts and lifting those large vehicles. There's not space in that existing area to do that. We've looked at that issue several times over the last 10 to 15 years to try to find a way to put the fleet garage at the Public Works facility. It just hasn't really worked out.
We've actually looked at trying to expand our footprint over there recently for other purposes and for reasons, competing reasons of other governmental entities. The space just isn't available, at least not in the foreseeable future. So it is something that we've looked at, that possibility, that we just don't have the property there to utilize. And it's not available, we've looked. But good question, that would be ideal. Sir?
Yeah, at the fleet maintenance facility, the Civic Center, have you looked at the soil there? Is it contaminated, require remediation as well?
That's a good question. That came up last time. I think part of the answer is you never know until you put a shovel in the ground for sure what's going to be below the earth. But I know, David, you wanted to add to that from last time as well.
Yes, we haven't done a specific environmental study or phase 1 or phase 2, if you're familiar with the industry terms. We have not completed those in the Village Hall site, including the fleet maintenance site. I would suspect that given the land uses that have been on this property going back to the 1920s as a ball bearing factory, other industrial uses, we can expect environmental issues on this site as well. The good news is that with multifamily redevelopment, especially in the western suburbs, these apartment developers are very familiar with working with and addressing these types of remediation issues. We know that there's similar types of redevelopment efforts going on in LaGrange and the old YMCA site, recently constructed apartments in Wheaton of this sort. It's very common to encounter things like leaky underground storage tanks, those kind of things that have been there for years. So I think we will encounter something, and I think it will be part of the redevelopment proposal we work out with the developer, and most likely we would make sure that they are responsible for remediating any environmental issues to IEPA standards. That being said, we do work closely with the state fire marshal on any of the underground storage tanks and above ground storage tanks that we maintain, making sure we're not creating a problem or worsening a problem we're not aware of.
And two more things on that. Number one, we do have a fair amount of experience of finding out what lies below in this area because of the development that's taken place in the downtown vicinity over the last 15, 20 years. So shovels have been put in the ground, not specifically on this site, but we have some history and some idea of what happens when you start to dig holes in this area. The other thing that Dave touched upon is with respect to some types of this environmental contamination, particularly leaking underground storage tanks, there are state and federal funds potentially available to help offset the cost of doing some of that stuff. With the private development that we've seen, particularly what's called it's always a fun acronym, the LUST Fund, or the Leaky Underground Storage Tank Fund in Illinois, dollars are typically made available to address those issues in order to facilitate and encourage the redevelopment of those sites that otherwise probably wouldn't. We did have a question see, auto lock on the phone, sorry. We did have a question from someone watching at home. There are currently 4 landlocked residential parcels for sale located between the northern part of Grant Avenue and to the southern Aldi lot line. Is it the intent of the village to acquire these lots along with the Aldi parcel for Phase 1?
No, we have no plans to go further into that residential neighborhood. We want to develop this development with village facilities and commercial uses only on the Ogden Avenue frontage and the property that's shown here. We do know those properties are for sale. Our comprehensive plan calls for residential uses on those 4 lots, and we intend to, unless anything changes we're not aware of, we intend to allow the private sector to proceed with residential development of those 4 lots. There are no proposals on the table for those 4 lots right now.
Other questions from? Please go ahead, sir.
Second question. Have you looked at the overall impact on the operating and maintenance budget of the village with all these different consolidations and movements?
I'll turn that over to those who are most responsible for the village budget, at least its implementation.
I would say on a preliminary basis, yes, we have begun to look at what the impacts would be. Certainly there are advantages anytime that you build a new facility, to design it in a way that improves efficiency, that allows for the space to be used in a way that allows the workforce and customer interactions to take place in a much more efficient manner than is occurring right now. You heard before about how the operations of the fire department in responding to calls, particularly in the northwest area of town, would change as a result of this location of that station. If we were not to go forward with this project and the relocation of the station, we may be having conversations in the future about what else we could do to meet those service demands for fire and EMS response. So I would say yes on a preliminary basis, but certainly as we start working with design professionals, there will be much more to be done on how this impacts operations.
That's probably as good a point as any to come back to this concept of intergovernmental cooperation that is very much part of the proposal that's currently being pursued. We are openly reaching out to other units of government to see if there's an opportunity here to partner with them for shared facilities. Just for example, you may have seen or read that District 58, the school district that is roughly contiguous with Downers Grove in terms of its service area, not exactly, but pretty darn close. They also have some real pressing facilities needs right now, and they're in the midst of a conversation about that very topic of how are they going to solve their issues going forward, what do they do with some of their facilities that are past their useful life. We are openly in conversations with them, and we'll be having meetings with the District 58 board soon to discuss the possibility of partnering and sharing space with the idea of reducing the costs and impacting the budget for both organizations. And just for example, we frequently talk about the fact that not too long ago, Downers Grove and Westmont combined their 911 call centers. So instead of each community having one, we share one. The budget impact of that was to save both communities several $100,000 on an annual basis. That's one example of how the type of intergovernmental cooperation and collaboration or consolidation can work to have real meaningful impacts positively on municipal budgets. So we're having those conversations with District 58. We're planning to continue those conversations to see what we can do. The point being, as long as we're building something and space is available, why can't we see if we can kill more than one bird with one stone? But that's not the only example. There are other possibilities and opportunities that are out there for partnering with other governmental entities and other agencies who have space needs. As long as we're designing something, if we could design it with someone else in mind, and they're also helping to support and contribute towards the project, that ultimately has a benefit for shared constituents. So all that's still preliminary. Like many of these things are, as we sort of move forward, we learn more about them. We are vigorously pursuing those types of partnerships.
Mayor, let me jump in on something there too. A little broader sense, there's what you're seeing here is a work towards an end in a direction that we think makes sense. There's a lot that's preliminary and unknown, and one of the things we're trying to do is undersell, if you will, the benefits portions. We do believe there would be some benefit from consolidation in terms of operational costs, but what we're trying to do is shoot high and come in better We have an experience here in town with a couple of projects, a downtown parking garage and a fire station. They ended up distinctly different, in terms of how they worked versus planned, so to speak. And so we got, as the mayor said when we first started, this meeting started in 2007-ish on some plans. This year, this group spent time looking at about 4 alternatives to what you're seeing tonight, and this seemed like the best path to head down. There are still, as you've heard, many, many unknowns, and we're trying to work through it. Part of the point of these meetings is to let you know where we are at this point and solicit questions about things that help us work down that path, things we may not have thought of. It's a process that I think we all agree needs to happen. What the final product looks like, I don't know, but there will be opportunities for sharing, there will be opportunities for consolidation, there will be opportunities for reduced O&M costs in either facility or this one, if we were to even decide ultimately that the best course is rehabbing this one. But those kinds of benefits, we don't want to use to try and oversell the plan that we're trying to pursue right now.
Thank you, Commissioner. Sir?
Excuse me, I appreciate the opportunity to come out. I'm a 30-year resident of Downers Grove. First time I've actually come out to a town hall meeting. And I certainly appreciate your time and spent on this issue. And it sounds like the plan that's put forward is a very well thought out plan. I am a current law enforcement practitioner in close proximity to here. I'd rather not mention where, but I'm here as a resident today. I've been in the police department in my career many times, and I don't fully think that this group understands the constraints of the current facility as part of modern policing practices today. I think we've got a very good police department here, and I think I look at it very critically as a law enforcement professional and evaluate the type of police services that we provide this community. And I can tell you that in the law enforcement community, this police department is very well thought of. It's an accredited police department. It's a police department that has spent time, money, and resources in developing its personnel. And it's why it is today, because they have good management, good oversight, and a community that holds them to a high standard. But I think what we've done here is we've taken our 5-star police department, because that's where the expectations are of this community, and we've constrained them into working out of a 1-star building. And I'm not sure that people understand in the community the constraints this puts on modern police practices. Just for example, if I'm a complainant and I'm reporting a very sensitive issue, let's say a sexual assault of a family member, I'm reporting that to a police officer in an open lobby where people are walking by, where people are walking in. There's a lack of rooms where people can be interviewed. Complainants can be interviewed. Residents in this community can be interviewed. We've got a booking facility in the police department that puts officers at risk because they can't segregate people. And that could potentially put the officers in a position where they would have to use a level of force that may not be necessary if we had the right facility. We've got evidence storage issues in the police department where they're just not where the standards require them to be. In listening to the discussion on this, I think the village has considered changes to this for the last 7 years. And I hate for this issue to get kicked down the road, and we kick the can down the road. I'm certainly a very fiscally conservative person, and I realize as a resident of this community, it's the cost of this is going to fall to the taxpayers. But I think one of the primary missions of local government is public safety, first and foremost. That's a core responsibility of government. And I don't think we're providing the level of public safety to this community that we expect, requiring our police department to work out of a building that they're in today. I also think, and I know, that I think we've understated the impact and threat to the police facility, which is also our 911 center, that the railroad has, and the chemicals and freight cars coming through our community at 40 miles an hour And I think if the residents were aware of the types of materials and the hazardous materials that were going through this community, and they realized the impact that would have on the community if there was a derailment or God forbid, a major chemical spill, this area would all be evacuated. I don't think we had the foresight when this building was built in 1979 to see that. But that's a significant threat to village operations and public safety. Because if there is a tanker that has a collision with a semi-trailer at the tracks and Washington here, it's going to take out this facility. This is our 911 center. This is our village emergency operations center. This is the police headquarters. This is the village headquarters. And those services are not going to be accessible for a long period of time. So what's caused me to come out to a meeting as a 30-year resident is I think I see a distinct need here. And I hate for this issue to be kicked down the road and not addressed and wait for a referendum to occur or wait for more studies to occur. I think we need to make changes now. The last thing I want to see as a resident is us putting more tax dollars into a building that's only going to have to be replaced in the future, into a building that we're going to end up tearing down, into a building that's next to a railroad that's carrying hazardous materials down, that's jeopardizing the safety of the people in this community. So I like the plan. I like the idea of having, the commercial facilities on Ogden Avenue. I think that's a well-thought-out plan. I hope everything commercial that's going in is going to be sales tax generating. And I hope that maybe, if this site is redeveloped, and I really think that's a great idea to redevelop the site because as an empty nester myself, I'm always looking to downsize, and I would certainly like to look at what this facility is going to look like to see if it meets our needs. I think there's a lot of people in this community, many of my neighbors who've talked about if the right development is in place, we want to stay in Downers Grove. We want to move close to the downtown area. We want to put our cars away and walk to everything. I think that's a great plan to go forward. I think it's not necessary to have the police department anymore located in close proximity to the downtown area for access. I think more and more people conduct business by phone and electronically, and the need to have the police department in the downtown area, and even the village hall on a prime piece of downtown property is something that's not necessary. So I would like to see this area maximized for sales tax generating purposes and residential purposes. I certainly, as a resident, would not like to see more commuter parking down here because I really don't think that adds anything to the community, but traffic congestion and more problems. And I know from studies that most of the commuters do not spend their dollars when they get off the train and visit the local businesses. They come in very short windows, create a lot of congestion, and they leave in very short windows with a lot of congestion. So I would hope that you give serious consideration to moving this proposal forward expeditiously as possible. I think it's a great idea to have the partnerships, because I certainly know that there's a number of partnerships with other parts of government that are going to save me as a taxpayer money, and I think that's a great out-of-the-box approach. I don't know if it's been mentioned, but I know our Downers Grove Traffic Court is at the VFW, which is a nice facility, but this is DuPage County, this is Downers Grove. Do we want our residents going into a VFW hall when they go to traffic court? And I think this is where the traffic court used to be. This is a much nicer facility. I don't think the VFW hall is really up to our standards when it comes to a public building where we're going to hold court, and I would certainly like to see if it's possible that courthouse, which is paid for by DuPage County, could be part of this new facility and could be incorporated into that. So thank you for your time, and appreciate it.
Well, thank you for coming out for the first time in 30 years. We appreciate that. And thank you for those comments, particularly the last one, which is an interesting idea that we'll certainly include in consideration. And appreciate the law enforcement perspective on that. Just one thing I want to add, because I did share it on Thursday with the audience then, and it goes to your point, I think it's an important fact for everyone to realize. Our police department is outstanding, and it's also accredited. 3 years ago, it was accredited through a very rigorous process by an organization called CALEA, which is the Commission on Law Enforcement Accreditation. So, thank you. And there's a rigorous application process, testing. They come out and they put you through the ringer, top to bottom. And the good news was 3 years ago, our police department was accredited by CALEA, which was terrific. And as they typically do at the end of their review, they sort of had a breakout session where they will tell you their informal conclusions, and then they submit them formally, and then hopefully you get the formal accreditation later. 3 years ago, when they had that breakout meeting, everything was fantastic. Spoke very highly of the department, the procedures, their training, everything. Outstanding, great news to hear. One guess what they raised as a negative. It was the facility, and that was 3 years ago. Our police department just went through the CALEA accreditation process again, had the breakout meeting. We're hoping we're going to get the official accreditation results soon. Again, rave review, very high marks, training, processes, everything. Operations, fantastic. This time, the folks from CALEA who are from outside organizations, they're not even from Illinois, who come in and do the review and the assessment and put everybody through the ringer. This time, they put front and center the issue of the facility as one of the problems. Everything is terrific, but you've got to really you've got to address this facility. So I only want to mention that as just another fact point, that when our police department goes through national accreditation process like that, the facility is a open blemish in that process. And I know the number of you who have toured it, and you've probably seen it, but I just wanted to add that as an additional fact. That's something that it was mentioned 3 years ago. It was loudly mentioned more recently.
Mayor, if I could jump in?
Absolutely.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said about the need for the new police department. And thinking about that and the other options that we had considered earlier in the year, and the gentleman's point that that ultimately it's the taxpayer, it's all of us, that have to fill the gap here if there is a gap. One of the questions that came forward on Thursday was the other options and the cost and the ultimate price tag on this. I think the determination was made fairly early that this was actually one of the lower net impact options. And I was wondering if we were able to dig out the slide, or if we have that information, Dave, that we could present on what we expected the delta to be on the other options that included rehabbing the facility here or building new facilities here.
Yes, we did, as you said, discuss those in detail in February and March of this year. We will repost all that information on our website. We're going to refresh it again in the next couple of days. The first option was just to replace existing systems. That's the $10 million number we talked about. The issue there is after spending $10 million, we would still have undersized buildings, oversized buildings at Village Hall, operational challenges. The second option was a major remodel or perhaps additions. The cost there was up to $35 million with a gap between revenues available and that cost of somewhere between 16 and 22 million. The third option was tear down the buildings and build them again here new. That presented some development and construction challenges because how do you occupy the same site that you're working on while you're working on it? The costs there were between $36 and $41 million, give or take, but the revenue sources associated with the plan we're talking about today were not all available to us, and the gap there in the financing was somewhere between $22 and $28 million. This option here that we've talked about in detail has a financial gap of around $18, $20, $22 million. $18 million is the one we've highlighted here today and in our budget documents. So when we compare not only the cost, but the value proposition of what other problems are we solving? Are we addressing commercial development? Are we getting the comprehensive plan adopted and implemented on Ogden? Are we getting the downtown redevelopment that downtown management has called for, that our plans called for? We rolled all that up in here, and at least at this point, it looks like this option we're pursuing is the best balance of costs and community benefits and community value. We will put all that information back on the website.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I actually want to encourage any more comments here from the audience here today. We appreciate the comments so far. I'll be right over. I also wanted to encourage anyone who's watching it from home to continue to send in email questions for a little bit here. I think we had said originally from 9 to 10, but if they're coming in, we'll be happy to answer them. And we appreciate everyone who's watching at home for not only doing so, but also for sending in their questions. I know there's a few things probably from Thursday we might want to bring up here today yet in the time we have remaining, but we do have a question from the studio audience, so let me bring the microphone over there. Sir?
Appreciate that. Good morning. This is a very complex plan. It has a lot of moving parts, and a lot of the plan includes a lot of hope. And you've come up with a number, and I was wondering what the worst-case scenario would be. As part of your plan, do you have like a PERT chart or something if something falls through? For example, let's say there are no other governmental entities that want to participate. They say thanks, but no thanks. Let's say the $14 million sale of the property falls through because of the multifamily thing. The gentleman mentioned high risk of being near the railroad tracks. First off, you got noise, you got vibration, and thanks for bringing up the fact that you can have an explosive cars parked right in front of your buildings, so maybe you won't get that $14 million. And what about the downtown TIF? Any TIF or SSA impacts on that building? And then the idea of having retail, I mean, it's nice to plan, oh, well, we're going to have retail, and, you know, we've heard these things before, you know, how nice it would be to put a Walmart up, which is great, and you can hope for a Walmart, or you can hope for an Aldi, but what happens if that falls through? I mean, this property has been sitting there with nothing for so long, so there's, like I say, there's a lot of moving parts. What's the worst-case scenario? And what's the price tag of the worst-case scenario?
I don't have a price tag, I know Dave does, but I will say this, as we go through our process and planning for this, we have, and it's incumbent that we always find ways out. Many of our contracts have, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to get the term right, but we have outs. We have ways to say, if this happens, then we can terminate the agreement. If for some reason we don't get the right amount of sale of the land, we can reconfigure. You know, there's always going to be votes.
Conditions precedent.
Thank you. There's always going to be votes by this council along the way. I'm not going to say baby steps, but there's going to be steps along the way to ensure that we are double-checking, triple-checking, gut-checking to make sure we're making the right decisions as we go forward. These numbers may go up and down a little bit, but there's going to be time for us to decide and amend as we go through this process. We are very early on in the steps. We've only made a very few decisions. A couple of big ones. The budget year for 2015 has some dollars allocated. But each time there's something related to this project, there's going to be a first reading and an active agenda item, just like every other item that we discuss in village business. So there's always going to be a way to say yes or no from the 7 of us with input from our staff. So sorry for jumping in front of you, Dave, on the finance question there. But
No, let's just build on that. I think Bill's right. Former Commissioner Waldeck asked the question. There's a high degree of complexity with this plan, and I think it goes hand in hand with being innovative and creative in trying to solve multiple problems and minimize the impact to existing taxpayers. That being said, this complexity sets up for many, many phases of development and many, many decision points. Like any project, there's no one vote by a council that says we're doing this project and then it's just one vote and you go, especially with this kind of project. There are many, many decision points from the time we look at hiring professionals like architects and owners' representatives, by the time we update cost estimates. There's checkpoints if we were to go forward with a contract to purchase the Ogden and Lacey piece. There's nothing in here that commits us to all portions of this plan at any stage. So when Bill was talking about what if the market changed for the desirability of redevelopment of the Civic Center site, well, the great news there is we actually could stop the plan and not proceed with phase 2. So each of these things, each phase, each decision has to stand on its own merits and its own costs and benefits. So we could acquire the site at Ogden and Lacey, spend TIF dollars getting it ready for a development, and then conclude that it's not suitable for public development. It's better suited for just a car dealer or just commercial. And that could be our TIF contribution, and we could let that proceed that way. So many times to check and recheck, so many outs that were protected, and this will play out over a 2 to 3 year period. So it's designed to really minimize the concept of we put a lot of public dollars forward and commit them and then hope it goes well. It's actually the opposite. It's checks and balances throughout.
And Dave, could you talk a little bit about the in-between size, as I think it was put on Thursday, of the Ogden and Lacey site?
Yeah, in addition to the challenges we've already talked about in the Ogden and Lacey site, another challenge is the fact that the commercial developer industry says that this is an in-betweener depth site. This site is 450 feet deep, give or take. For strip style or outlot style development, you want somewhere around 175, 180, 200 feet of depth. If you want to go with a big box retailer, you want 800 to 1,000 feet of depth. This is 450. It's too big for strip outlot type. It's not big enough for large box. And we haven't, over the last decade or 2 decades, been able to identify a retail or commercial user that thinks this is just right. And that's where our plan comes in, because most of the developers are looking for somebody who could take 3, 4, 5 acres, who don't desire or don't need commercial frontage on Ogden and are happy being hidden away out of sight, out of view. We fit that bill with this proposed use.
Go ahead, please, Commissioner.
Mr. Waldeck, too, I think, to clarify another part of your question was, the partnership concept, there's no anticipated revenue included in these numbers. So if that happens, that's just a bonus. It's not something, if it doesn't happen, it's taken away. And then also the sales tax component is not at all included in these numbers. So that would also be an add-on rather than a subtraction.
Thank you, good clarification. Let me just add one thing, and then we're going to take another question that came in by email, and then we have another question here in the audience. Case in point, there was once upon a time, and Bill, you may even recall it, once upon a time there was a proposal to do a mixed-use residential commercial project on this Ogden and Lee site, and it was based on a lot of what-ifs, a lot of conditions. And initially, it was allowed to go forward, but as things didn't pan out and as things changed, it quickly became clear that it shouldn't continue to go forward, and it didn't. So that's just one example of, as I think Commissioner Neustadt was mentioning, there are a lot of assumptions, there are a lot of conditions, but as you really find out how things are going to be in actuality, you have opportunities to make decision points and to change course at that point in time, and there are many such forks in the road that are built into this path that we're headed down. I would just answer your question about what's the worst case scenario, and I'm only going to be a little tongue-in-cheek when I say this. Worst case scenario is that we don't do anything. That would be the worst case scenario, because that would just make a 37-year-old problem much worse. That would not be, I think, acceptable to anyone. A question that we had from one of the folks watching at home, and I think I can probably answer a couple of these, is one, how would the village acquire the Aldi lot? I'm going to let Mr. Fieldman answer that because he did so well on that question on Thursday. Would there be an outright purchase, or is there the possibility that a land exchange would take place between the village and Aldi? I suspect the answer is, while anything's possible, that's probably unlikely. The example given was, would Aldi trade part of its parcels for on Ogden for lots in the downtown or some investment in the new residential structure? I'm going to take a wild guess and suggest that that kind of arrangement, while creative, is probably not within Aldi's mission statement or their business plan. So while it's always possible, it's probably unlikely. But then I'll go back to the question to Mr. Fieldman is, currently contemplated, how would the village acquire, or would the village acquire the Aldi lot, and if so, how?
So obviously, with this plan going forward, we would eventually end up in an ownership position of at least the red portion of the property. There are a variety of options for land acquisition and development that we're currently considering. The first is where we would enter into an agreement with a developer that was chosen by Aldi. Aldi has relationships with developers, the developers that are very familiar with this site. One option is we could enter in an arrangement, a contract with that developer. They could do certain types of development for us, and we would reimburse them. We'd have to come up with those details. So in that case, that could be the developer buying the land from Aldi and then reselling a portion of it to the village, only the portion we need, and they would maintain ownership of the commercial portions. The other option is that the village would directly purchase the property from Aldi, and then we, through our public process, could hire development and construction professionals that meet our needs, and then we could sell off the commercial properties at a different time. All of these different options are being considered in terms of how much development risk is the village willing to take on, and what are the financial returns to the village. Ultimately, we want to balance those needs to get the best overall value for the community, the buildings at the lowest cost, making sure we align and only do the things that we are good at and let the private sector and developers do what they're good at. As far as acquiring the land directly from Aldi, we did look at a land exchange. That's asking the question. Mayor, you're exactly correct. Aldi's good at building Aldi stores and did not have any interest in building an Aldi store on this site in the Civic Center. Would not be a good fit for anybody, so that was quickly discarded.
No Aldi on the first floor and Village Hall on the second floor?
We did ask about that as well. That did not turn out so well either. Also, we looked at the concept of donating land. There are some benefits to anybody who donates land to a municipal entity. For a lot of reasons, that didn't work out either. So we're exploring all options, but it looks like either a direct purchase or working with an Aldi selected developer are the options on the table right now.
Let's be clear, though, we do have some experts on staff, and one of them just spoke. I mean, this is his background. He's village manager here, but his background has been in planning, and these deals, while are complex and have many moving parts, Dave has been part of these deals from the municipal side and private side for a little bit.
Very short time.
That's a great asset to have for our community right now. But beyond that, we had the Economic Development Corporation here a few months back, and they spoke to this as well. And there are some brilliant minds in that group that confirmed that this plan is viable and will provide the right economic incentive for our community. So we're crossing off all the things off the list that we can, but having the staff that we have here, not only here present today, but our planning staff, our fire prevention staff, everybody that's our police department staff, finance staff, legal department, the clerk's office, I could go down the list, but everybody is weighing in on this at the right time and right level because we want to make sure that we do have all those things cross-checked and checked. And we are very, very fortunate to have some very smart minds working on this project on our behalf, advocating for us at the Economic Development Corporation level, and we will exhaust every opportunity to find ways to make this complex issue not so complex and benefit the community.
A good point, and do want to recognize that there are folks who volunteer on our Economic Development Corporation board and in the group generally who do this all day long in the private sector, and this is what they do, so they have that data expertise. I will try to eliminate a heart attack for Michael Cass at the EDC. They weighed in on the sensibility of this plan from a land use perspective and an economic development perspective. Ultimately, of course, it is our responsibility to make sure that this is financially viable and responsible for the Village of Downers Grove, and there we also have very, very astute professionals who are working on that, and ultimately the decision is ours. The EDC, their main focus was, from an economic development standpoint, does this fit with the mission? Is this a good use of the land that is involved in the proposal? That was principally what they weighed in on. The rest of it is primarily our responsibility. Another question from the studio audience, sir?
Well, basically, I see Phase 1 as almost a no-brainer. I'm not excited about a tax levy as a taxpayer, but no taxpayer is. Basically, we're sending out a first-class police department doing their work in a 1979 squad car with 350,000 miles on it. So that part's a no-brainer. The reason I'm here is there is a petition being circulated to put this out as a referendum. And number one, I guess my question is how soon can we vote on it? And, what are the politics involved with that step?
Thank you. The top topic did come up, and I have a feeling Commissioner Barnett wants to comment on this one. The topic did come up, and I think there's principally three reasons why, at least in the discussions that have taken place so far, why there is a view currently that this is not an appropriate topic for a referendum. And I'll let my colleagues weigh in on it. Three pieces. Number one, I'll just start with what we've been talking about all day long, which is the complexity and sort of the moving parts of this. If I were to try to write up what the referendum question would be, I don't know if I could, and it would be different next week. Because as you've seen, as we move forward on this path and we get new information, things change, and as has been pointed out by my colleagues, there are decision points along the way which, depending on how things pan out, we may take a turn. And so to have a fixed point in time that says, do you want to do X? X is a moving target because of the nature of this project, so I'm not sure how we could put all this into a referendum question that would be meaningful for the people who are making the decision. That's actually part of the reason why we decided to have these town hall meetings. As you can see, it takes a couple of hours just to go through. We haven't even talked about everything that's involved in the process. It would be difficult to properly reflect it in a way that I think would be meaningful. That's one concern that we have. Another concern that we have is that what we have heard is that, well, why is this question any different than any other thing that we vote on every Tuesday night? We recently passed a $136 million budget for the Village of Downers Grove. This project is dwarfed by the size of that budget. And what we do is we hold meetings. We held 9 meetings. We're still holding meetings in the budget. We entertain input. We've had conversations. We've made changes. We've made adjustments. And then ultimately, we do what we were all elected to do. What we were elected by you to do is to make decisions on these, clearly a big issue, $136 million budget. And that's part of a process of input and due diligence and exchange of ideas and discussion, and then making the decisions that we were elected to do. I think you told me last time our last stormwater bond that we issued was about $25 million.
Correct.
$25 million. We're talking about a net impact here of 18. $25 million stormwater. That was something that through the discussions with the community, through conversations, through due diligence, that decision was made. Frankly, it's our job to make those kind of decisions. That's what we were elected to do. So we've been looking at it as we're doing our job, not through trying to put together what would be a real head scratcher of a referendum question that might not even be relevant by the time it's voted on, because the plan could be different. That this was the way to really engage the community. Have town hall meetings like this, continue the conversation, hear the questions, identify those decision points, those forks in the road, and as we go forward, there are, as has been pointed out, there are going to be opportunities to change direction or not do it at all, depending on what we encounter as we move forward. But through a process that began at least 7 years ago, and most recently with the 4 proposals that were looked at in February and through a series of public meetings, this is the path that seems to make the most sense. And so the dollar amount issue of it didn't seem to be different than other things that we do, and that we, I think, really feel that we should first and foremost do what our job is, what we were elected to do, which was to make tough decisions. Of course, in conjunction with the residents of Downers Grove, hearing the input, having a conversation, exchanging facts, which we hope what we're doing today and Thursday and frankly every Tuesday, or every coffee with the council, every email that comes in, we do that all the time. So while this is obviously of very high importance for the community, this is probably the largest public facility project that we've done in a long time and may do for a long time. There's no question about it. But I think that's why we've tried to be very, very mindful of the obligation to provide information, to have an ongoing dialogue, make sure that everybody understands what we're doing, and take all that into account. So that's a long answer, at least from my perspective, to a short question. But I think the main problem that I've really scratched my head with is the logistics of doing it. It's not a straightforward question like, should we put a stoplight at Ogden and Lee? That's a pretty black and white question. As you can see, there's a lot more to this one that's not black and white, and I hate to say the name of a book, but it's more like 50 Shades of Gray. And those shades may change as we move forward, but I don't know if others want to comment on it, but that's sort of, when the topic has come up, what the thinking has been.
Yeah, let me expand on that a little bit. 50 Shades of Grey and the lust funds aside, Mayor. Just saying. Just saying. No,
Nice guy with his attention.
Yeah, that's right. It's obviously a fair question. Shouldn't, it could be characterized, if you're going to change the face of the village in multiple ways, touching on three of the primary things that we as a village do, police, fire, and public services, and spend $52 million, shouldn't you ask everybody's opinion on that? I totally understand that kind of frame up of the question. The problem is it was asked on Thursday night, where's your no-go, where's your go, no-go decision? What is that decision and what's the timing on it? The answer, unfortunately, as the mayor kind of was alluding to earlier, there isn't one. This is a series of decisions, and so how would you frame that up to say, should we continue to pursue a contractual relationship with someone about trying to figure out how to redevelop Ogden and Lacey? That's like question number one. That is kind of where we're headed. That in itself could flop and result in us changing direction. So the problem is, we heard this morning a little bit about policing. We could talk for days, perhaps, on each one of these individual elements, and none of them necessarily define the end result. So there was a very eloquent set of comments made this morning about policing, for instance. And I think that everybody on this dais would agree with that. And some of those goals, those challenges with our existing facility, goals about the future, risks associated with where we are. Yet at the end of the day, if we can't get some of these other things to go, that wouldn't get fixed. That is one potential outcome. We think that leaving it in that state is not the right one, but it is one of the potential ending points unless we can get through a series of other questions and a series of other decisions, and frankly, a series of other negotiations as we go to, whether it's to deal a contract for land or it's to employ somebody for design services. Each one of those elements could turn out to be not as expected and cause us to change our path. And so we could make this, I'm going to stick with police, we can make a very good, solid, factual-based case for a police station change and still ultimately not decide to do that because these other things can't come together. So when you think of it that way, I suggest it doesn't lend itself well to a sentence or 6 even on a referendum question. It's just, I don't think it's that kind of a process. I understand why some folks initially believe it is. I hope that through these processes of meetings, people will start to understand that it's not that kind of decision. But I think that's why we're at the point where we're at right now of having had a series of meetings and now trying to have more and still not, as a group, deciding we should be on a referendum kind of a question. If that helps.
Thanks, Commissioner.
I would agree.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I'd agree with that. I think that, we're talking about some of the logistics is what you asked about, how does that happen? And there are logistics and rules, and the Election Commission has outlined those. So I think, is it 6 lines or however many characters can be within a referendum question? It just doesn't lend enough room to our 56-slide presentation that we had today, plus I don't know how many pages of other backup documents that we have, and we've been going through since 2007 and beyond, and even in this just year. Generally, governing by referendum is not something that I'm in favor of. I'm in favor of more of this conversation, and I think we've gone out of our way as a council and as an organization to bring this topic to the residents. The 7 of us, our village staff, is always available, not just on Tuesday nights for conversations, and I'm actually quite pleased to see we had a handful of folks participate virtually today. I think that worked out pretty well. Trying to make big decisions and important decisions is something we take very seriously here, and we, again, go out of our way to make sure that we get everything out there the right way to our residents and to ourselves, basically, so we can have a conversation and then have a conversation with the folks in our community. So, there are so many moving parts to this that I agree with what's been said already. I don't know how you could even formulate a question that would try to capture the scope of this project.
There's another thing about the results of a referendum that I think is important. You could take either side of this opinion, just should this plan be pursued, should this plan not be pursued, place it out there for a vote and get a result. Either way, whether that came back as a positive or a negative, still might not in fact be something that your local government could affect. Let's say it came back negative. We still have to do something with these facilities, and your local government will do something with the facilities. Let's say it came back a positive, as laid out sort of here tonight. There's still people, other people, third parties who would have to willingly participate at prices we believe they think they should or they might, that could also still not happen. So the idea that it is somehow a decision maker in an environment like this, I think is just kind of maybe a little unrealistic, because I don't think we know as much as you need to know to ask a question.
And before we go to Commissioner Jose, I'm sorry, I just want to pick up something that Jeff said. This community, and it's a terrific asset and a benefit of being in this community, has deservedly so very high level of engagement, being informed, and expectations in terms of input. And one of the things that I've learned in conjunction with responsibilities with the DuPage Mayors and Managers Group is I have an opportunity to see how things are like in a lot of other communities in DuPage County. And without disparaging and without any intent to disparage other communities, it is often very clear to me that Downers Grove, when it comes to engagement with the residents and what we expect and what residents expect in terms of engagement on this kind of a level, not a, we're going to put it on an agenda, take 5 minutes of comment from a bunch of people, and then we're going to vote and have a nice day. But this kind of in the seats, in the backyard kind of discussion and engagement is something that Downers Grove is head and shoulders above most communities. Everybody here expects that, deservedly so. We think it's one of the things that makes this community special and separates us from others and truly makes us a leader. But what that means is that we as a community make these decisions, and we make them in the most responsible fashion. And again, like everything else, this is a path that we're on that we think is right now the best way forward. So that's, again, sort of a long way of answering the question. Commissioner?
Thank you, and I actually wanted to pick up on that, and I think staff and perhaps Commissioner Reinking can speak more intelligently and eloquently to it than I can, but Jeff alluded to the rules of the Election Commission and the Election Code. If you do go to a referendum, and there are certain limitations on how we can engage the residents if a referendum question is placed on the ballot, and I think that's important to recognize. There is way too much to this, as others have said, than to fit into a 6-line question on a ballot. There are a lot of moving parts, and when you deconstruct those moving parts, I don't see the principled basis to putting this on the ballot that I'd like to see. Because when you deconstruct it, we spend, as has been said, this amount of money on other things without going out to referendum. The village builds new facilities, acquires property or sells property, engages in economic development agreements, and does all of these things on a fairly routine basis without going out to referendum. And I'm not sure that putting them all together into a project of this size necessarily means that we should go out to referendum with it. The residents of Downers Grove have entrusted the 7 of us to make these decisions. We obviously go through a fairly deliberative process, and there are a lot of votes to be made along the way. There's a lot of information yet to come, and a lot of opportunity for folks to give us input along the way that will all weigh into the decisions that we ultimately make. And as Commissioner Barnett said, there are any number of things that could cause the village to put a stop to the process very quickly. There's a lot of information yet to come, and I just don't see the need to go out to referendum with it.
Ma'am, you've been very patient waiting. We have a question from the studio audience.
Sure, thank you. You've made a compelling argument to move forward with this, and I appreciate all the work that's gone into it. So if we move forward with this project, and it looks like a multi-year project, what other projects are going to be postponed, delayed, or eliminated because we move forward with this one?
That is a good operational question. Because the way I would understand that one is not so much capacity to do the project because the actual construction is going to be done by third parties. It's really a project management question, which I take that to mean, and that is probably most appropriately directed to our chief operating officer, the village manager, in terms of, that's a very good question. A project of this size, how do you see this impacting the organization's ability to do the other things it does? Understanding that this is not your first rodeo. There was Fire Station 2, we've had a parking deck, we've had other large projects in the community. How does that have an impact upon an already very lean organization?
I just give it all to Mike Baker and expect him to do all of it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So, we're very strategic in how we approach projects and workload and priorities here at the Village of Downers Grove. And each year, the staff and the council work together to create work plans and priorities. This particular implementation of a facilities plan was labeled a high priority project, and we know it will last 2, 3, 4 years, could last 2, 3, 4 years as we go into it. When we put together our work plans and our strategies and our priorities, we look at resource allocation, and we try to make sure that we have the resources on hand and only the resources on hand that we need to get through that list in the timeline we prescribe. We also pride ourselves on being very nimble and able to react to changing conditions. So we never want to be in a position where a project that would benefit the community is not pursued because we have a lack of resources. So to that end, we flex our staffing resources through the use of consultants and part-time employees so that we create and solutions, not or solutions. We try not to get in a situation of facilities or something else important. We try to get answers that are facilities and the other important projects. We laughed a little bit here because this is one of the most difficult things that we do on a regular basis through the council role and the staff role. How many consultants, how many staff members, how many private sector partners, how many public sector partners? So the answer is we reassess every year, and that's part of the program. So if we get to the point where this project could be displacing other important projects, we will go back to the council and say, we need some help, we need some more resources, and we'll reallocate.
If I could add just one thing in response to that question, because there is another dimension to it too that I wanted to address, and that has to do with other capital projects and commitments that this village has made and will make. And fortunately, over the past several years, probably the last 5 or 6 years, we've invested a significant amount of time and developed long-range strategic plans that commit funding sources and long-term planning for our other infrastructure systems, water, streets, sidewalks, stormwater, all have funding mechanisms in place right now that are not being consumed by what's recommended for this plan. So from that standpoint, it's not like we're going to be taking money away from those priorities and important infrastructure maintenance efforts that the residents absolutely expect.
Would we consider having a, what have we called it before for some of our major projects, where we basically have an owner representative who's involved that adds another layer of day-to-day oversight that is directly beholden and responsible and accountable to the village and to the residents, that is basically an extension of our village staff so that it doesn't take away from your ability for day-to-day operations and service of the community?
Yes, it's imperative for all the reasons you just mentioned, Mayor. And as we proceed with this plan, one of the first questions in front of the council and a series of questions will be, should we hire the owner's rep and under what circumstances and what costs? That question could be in front of the council as soon as January.
I know it's worked out very well in the past. We did have another question from the audience, and we're going to try to, because we're just at the 2-hour mark now.
Yeah, this is more of a comment. Timing is everything, and I think the timing is right for this project. We do need a new police department. The footprint here is just not adequate. You have a property, it may not be here in 10 years, who knows? Maybe Aldi builds a store, we don't know. Money's cheap if you have to float bonds. Surely with the economy strengthening, we'll see interest rates rise. You know, and it goes back to my question earlier, to look at it from the other side. If you wait 20 years, you're going to have to build it. You're going to have to do this, building at some point, and the delay could cost you dearly. So, just a consideration. I think it's a great project. I think it needs to be done, and I support it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think since we are just at over the 2-hour mark, I want to just take a moment to thank everyone who came out this morning on a Saturday, taking away from your busy schedules to be here. Very much appreciate all your mindful, thoughtful questions. We hope that we achieved our goal of an information exchange, of providing you more information about the current path so that folks can formulate an opinion based on information as opposed to maybe not complete information. This is by no means the end of a process. These were, as I mentioned, 2 special meetings that we added in addition to the meetings that we normally have on this topic and many other topics, so we welcome continuing to hear from people. And I also want to especially ask everyone that took the time to watch this from home and who sent in questions that we were able to address today. I think that worked out very well. I want to appreciate everyone for coming out. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and Merry Christmas to everyone. Happy holidays. Thank you.